Thank you all for taking the time. We have a lot of guests, distinguished guests, Congressman Jerry Lewis, Congressman Mike Hoffman. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to all our members. We will introduce you shortly. I would like to, on behalf of the Institute for Analysis of Global Security and my colleague Anne Corin, to maybe say a word or two on what this effort is all about. Everybody, since President Eisenhower, we've always heard about our dependence on oil, about the problem, we're importing too much of it and all that. And we're here almost half a century later still talking about the same issue. And when you have so many presidents talking about an issue, and at the same time the price of oil continues to rise, and only in the past decade since 9/11, oil prices grew fivefold. And it doesn't do good to our economy, as you know. So we have to stop and think, why is it that we're not succeeding? Maybe we have not identified the problem correctly. Maybe we should go back to the drawing board and think a little bit differently about the issue. We believe that the problem is not necessarily our dependence on foreign oil or even the amount of oil that we use as a society. The problem, as we understand it, is the monopoly or the virtual monopoly that oil has over transportation fuels by virtue of the fact that all of our cars, trucks, ships, and planes cannot run on nothing but oil. Stop and think about it. We have choice in every aspect of our lives, but in one field, one aspect of our lives that we all so depend upon, we do not have choice. And that is transportation fuels. And the reason is because our cars are programmed, are manufactured to run on nothing but petroleum. And that has to change. Because the role of government, beyond, of course, protecting us, is to create markets and enable them to work. And this is what we hope to achieve through the work of this distinguished council. This effort is not an anti-oil effort. It is a pro-choice effort, or may I say pro-fuel choice. This is what it's about. And we hope that with the work of the Council, with our advocacy, and certainly with your help and activism, we could gradually change the terms of the debate and bring about a slightly different way of looking at the issue, acting upon the issue, and changing the current regulatory framework to create those open markets and to enable competition in a sector that is so critical to everyone's lives. So in order for us to do this, I would like to first of all recognize our captains of the team, people that, two of our members, Bud McFarlane and Jim Woolsey, that have been together working for months to pull together a group like this. And we think that your leadership on this has been, over the years, critical to the future of our country. We'd like to thank you for it. And we will now, I'll give the honor to Bud McFarlane, former National Security Advisor, who has been instrumental behind this effort, to introduce the Council and introduce our moderator. We hope that all of you have a pleasant evening. Thank you all for being here again, and we look forward to working with you on this critical issue. Good evening.
Thanks very much, Gal. And thanks to each of you for coming, for caring, for coming out to learn a little bit more about the nature of the problem, the nature of the solution, for that is indeed the good news. Many of us, as you can see on the panel, are motivated by concerns over national security, but also of the economic impact of what Gall has framed as reliance upon a single fuel in a market so profoundly important to our economy, and the ultimate economic impact that that has. We will get on immediately into talking about the several dimensions of that vulnerability and of the solutions that are at hand by introducing alternative fuels. But let me get right at it and introduce our panel members and our moderator this evening, and that will be followed by questions posed to each of the panel members here by Frank Sesno, and then to invite your own questions to try to illuminate for you a basis for you to return to your own companies, institutions, positions in government, and become advocates to help in this effort. Let me start from your left. Vice Admiral Dennis McGinn, naval officer for over 30 years, and an advocate for the Green Navy and putting all of Navy vessels on green fuels by 2020. Admiral McGinn is now president of the American Council on Renewable Energy. Next to him, a close friend and colleague, Jim Roche. Jim served our country in the Navy for 23 years, and more recently as Secretary of the Air Force. Jim has also served as an official in Northrop Grumman and holds a distinction also of serving on a staff with me and one of our distinguished Senators, Scoop Jackson, many years ago. Senator Gary Hart. I had the pleasure of serving on a panel once before with Senator Hart, and in a somewhat frustrating exchange of views, someone in the audience asked, why can our government never develop an energy policy? Senator Hart said, we do have an energy policy. We rely on a single fuel. We buy it from a cartel controlled by people who don't like us very much. And every 5 years, we go to war to maintain that privilege. Senator Hart, until recently, has been a professor of environment, energy, and sustainability at the University of Colorado. Next to Senator Hart is Jim Woolsey, my close colleague and running mate in this effort and co-founder here. Jim served as Undersecretary of the Navy and then as Director of Central Intelligence, and currently is the chairman of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Next, former Secretary of Transportation, Mary Peters, who served in the administration of President George W. Bush. On my right, Dr. Alan Greenspan, Chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1986 until 2006. On my left, John Hoffmeister. Pay attention to this. John was the president of Shell North America. John was the president of Shell, oil company. And also a recent author of a book entitled Why We Hate the Oil Companies. It's a good book, I recommend it. John is also the founder of Citizens for Affordable Energy, fuel. Next to John Hoffmeister is Dr. Norman Augustine, well known as former Undersecretary of the Army, innovator, chairman, chief executive officer of the largest aerospace company in the world, Lockheed Martin. And I would draw your attention to his frequent service in chairing panels from the National Academy of Science, the National Academy of Engineering, and the Institute of Medicine, focused upon how our country can regain its competitiveness. I recommend it. Please go online and look at that report on what it will take for our country in energy, yes, but in our institutions, our academic institutions, to come back to being the leading country of innovation in the world. Next to Norm is Senator Bennett Johnston. Senator Johnston served in the Senate as chair of the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, Democrat from Louisiana, and a strong advocate for competition in the fuels market. Finally, our moderator for the evening, Frank Sesno, a friend and I guess I shouldn't say colleague from our White House years together, being on opposite sides of the podium at least. Frank is a well-known, honored journalist, having received many awards during his time as Washington Bureau Chief for CNN, moderator, frequent leader in shaping opinion since leaving CNN, and currently serving at the Institute for Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. Frank has been awarded an Emmy, currently is the creator and host of Planet Forward, a web-based, for TV, channel available to all of you. Check it out. I should also note that we are also joined tonight by Dr. Surya Prakash. Dr. Prakash has come from California and represents Nobel laureate Dr. George Olah, professor of chemistry and winner of the Nobel in 1994 for his focus upon methanol. Dr. Prakash is surely the person you ought to direct your questions about methanol to tonight. Thank you, one and all. I would close my remarks by turning for the welcome from California as well by former Secretary of State George Shultz. George, as you know, is credited properly for serving as secretary and of accelerating the collapse of Marxism, the end of the Cold War, and so many notable other achievements during the administration of President Reagan. A few of you in the audience are also have enough years to recall that George is a little bit like the Babe Ruth of American diplomacy and public service. If Ruth had 4 home runs in a game, as did Gil Hodges, Gehrig, and 1 or 2 others, how many people in public life have been in the cabinet 4 times? Secretary of Labor, head of the Office of Management and Budget, Secretary of the Treasury, prior to becoming the Secretary of State. We welcome now, from California, George Shultz.
Energy is vital to any economy, particularly ours. It's also vital for our national security. And we need to pay a lot of attention right now because many of our sources of energy have become very high in price and unstable in terms of potential supply. In addition, since much of the supply comes from other countries, We're sending a lot of money abroad, some of it falling into hands that don't wish us well. So we need to get with it and do something about it. I remember back when I was Secretary of the Treasury in 1973. President Eisenhower had thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we used, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. Well, I'm Secretary of the Treasury, and along comes the Arab oil embargo in 1973. I said to myself, you know, President Eisenhower had a point. Beyond that, the escalating price messed up our economy. We've been through that roller coaster. Price of oil goes up, we start to do something, goes down, we stop. This time, I hope it's different. The price of oil seems likely to stay relatively high. So that should stimulate us to look for other ways of finding energy for ourselves. In addition to doing as much as we can to develop our own sources of oil and gas here at home. For very little sum of money, particularly in the new car, $100 or something like that, engines can be refitted so that they are able to take alternative fuels. We've always relied on competition in this country, and why not let the internal combustion engine be opened up to competition from alternative fuels? At any rate, I think it is very much in our national security interests, very much in our economic interests, and personally I think there are climate issues to deal with, that we need to put this very much on the front burner, and we need to have our Congress look at these issues and perhaps instead of these big bills, rifle shot a few things. I'm sure that our country, as it always has in the past, when we see a major issue confronting us, particularly when that issue is so tied into our national security, that we take a deep breath and we start doing something about it. So let's go, America.
Before turning it over to Frank, I'd like to also acknowledge that bills to accomplish what the Secretary just mentioned have been introduced in the House of Representatives and today, indeed, in the Senate by Senator Lugar, in the House by Congressman Shimkus, Engel, Roscoe Bartlett, and Israel. So in addition to those gentlemen and to those already acknowledged, Congressman Jerry Lewis, we think we have a shot at moving these bills, but it's going to take some heavy lifting by each of you and us. Take it away, Frank.
Thank you very much, Bud. I think I'm wired here. I know I'm wired. So I'll pass on that. Will it be terribly disruptive if occasionally I pace back and forth like a caged lion? Is that good? It's okay? So I'm going to start doing that. First of all, I want to thank all of you. It's a pleasure, a true privilege to be here with such an august gathering and such a knowledgeable gathering. I don't know how many of you know this, but as Bud mentioned, we sort of traveled the world and locked horns on occasion because I was in the press and he was running the country in the White House some years ago. The world seemed so much simpler then by comparison. I mean, they're good guys and bad guys and white hats and black hats, and now it's so confusing. But we're going to dive into that. You talked about the Open Fuel Standard Act. You talk about competition under the hood. As Jim Woolsey knows, because we worked on a documentary I did for CNN some time ago, I went down to Brazil, and I was driving a Chevrolet. And I'm driving it through the sugarcane fields where they're making this sugar ethanol, and it's a flex fuel vehicle. And every vehicle virtually that's made and sold in Brazil is a flex fuel vehicle. And I said to the camera as I'm driving this car down the road, if I can do this in Brazil, why can't I do it in America? Senator Johnston, the question was raised, do we have an energy policy in this country with respect to oil? Do we?
Well, you know, Gary Hart answered that question. We have one, but it's the wrong one. You know, you might ask the question, is there any hope, is there any optimism anywhere in Washington? And the answer is yes, and it's in energy. Look at what we're doing in electric cars. You know, we're off to a great start with electric cars. That's what we need to do with methanol. MIT just did a great study on methanol, and they said that you can produce methanol $1 a gallon cheaper than gasoline. $1 a gallon cheaper than gasoline. That means that we can convert this economy to a very large extent using our natural gas and coal to a fuel that is cheaper and that does not need subsidy.
I want to talk, and we'll talk a lot about methanol throughout the evening, but Senator Hart, expand upon your comment there that we have this great policy that allows us to go to war every 5 years against people who don't like us, who are selling something that we shouldn't need but we buy more of because we have no choices. Great. Makes a lot of sense.
Well, let me clarify, first of all, Colonel McFarland's formulation. I had a sharper point on it. I said that we were relying, first, people think a policy is something that has 10 points and is spelled out carved in stone. It is and has been the policy of this country to import a quarter of its imported oil from the most dangerous region of the world, the Persian Gulf, to fuel the most energy inefficient vehicles on Earth, and if that supply of oil gets cut off, to sacrifice the lives of our sons and daughters to get the oil. That is a policy.
Or a lack of a policy.
It is a policy. It has been the policy we have followed for decades. And we have fought 2 Gulf Wars, and we haven't had the courage to say that oil had anything to do with either one of them. So we could at least be honest about it.
Jim Woolsey, why aren't we honest about it?
I think the capacity for self-deception is extraordinary. Look, I grew up learning to drive in the 1950s in Oklahoma, and we had 25 cent a gallon gasoline. Oil went for $2, $3, $4 a barrel. The Texas Railroad Commission had the role of OPEC. It basically set the world price for oil, and as an Okie, I'd have to say the Texans did pretty well. Life was good. And people remember that, and then something will happen like the Gulf War, or like the 1973 war, and people get excited about, we got to do something. And then what happens is the same thing that used to be made to happen by John D. Rockefeller in the late 19th century. People get geared up, get into the early stages of doing something, and then the price drops. 1985 to $5 a barrel. And everybody says, hey, it's always going to be like this, $5 a barrel, right? Party time. So what we have to do is find a way to move off oil's monopoly that doesn't require anybody to say, like I say, I think this is very heavily a national security problem, or it's very heavily, somebody else would say, a climate change problem. We have to find something that is cheaper and better. And we have to find a way that the vehicles can use it. And that's the heart of what this bill is about, making it possible for the vehicles actually to use alternative fuels. In this case, just 2, ethanol and methanol, but both have some positive things about them.
Admiral McGinn, we're talking about this in a national security context. Senator Hart says that part of our policy is periodically to have to go to war and sacrifice lives to keep this policy in place. As a military man, and a military man who's been committed to this, do you see these wars we've been fighting as oil wars?
Not entirely, but in a large measure, they are, Frank. I serve as Vice Chairman on the CNA Military Advisory Board, consisting of about a dozen retired 3- and 4-star admirals and generals from all 4 services in the Coast Guard. We put out a report in May of 2009 called Powering America's Defense, Energy and the Risks to National Security. The unanimous conclusion of that report was unambiguous. America's energy posture constitutes a serious and urgent threat to our national security, militarily, diplomatically, and economically. And further, that this vulnerability, primarily an over-reliance, a growing reliance, an addiction to oil, is exploitable by those who would wish to do the United States harm. So business as usual is not a viable option, or certainly it's a viable option, but it's not very attractive. And we'll find ourselves, if we continue on business as usual, with our backs against the wall, with far fewer options to choose from, and every one of them more expensive in dollars and in lives.
Secretary Peters, I see you nod your head there, and one of the comments that's made as we've gone through these cycles, and by the way, this is not restricted to government and politics, that when I started this project that I mentioned earlier, this documentary, I actually had pushback from some folks that, and this happens, you know, creative tension we call it, from producers who said, why do we need a documentary on energy? I mean, Jimmy Carter put his cardigan on 35 years ago. Nothing has changed, is what was said. And somehow I almost think that people perceive that. But if you were inside the government, inside the cabinet, and you have this kind of advice from the military and smart people saying these things, why wasn't the baton, why hasn't the baton been picked up?
I think my colleagues really hit the nail on the head. The price drops because the OPEC cartel recognizes that if they keep the price too high, we're going to do something.
So
if they drop the price, then we don't do anything. And I'll relate two circumstances to you. In the early 1970s, during the Arab oil embargo, I was a young wife and mother, and remember sitting in line to get gasoline that was very expensive and we couldn't get it. And I thought, this is crazy. This is insane. And wondered why we weren't doing something about it. Fast forward to some years later, the summer of 2008, when I was serving as Secretary of Transportation, fuel prices, oil prices spiked again. And I saw not only the security implications of that in a post-9/11 world, but I saw the economic implications of that as well. Transportation plays such an important part of our economy, and yet immediately, almost immediately, we saw drop-off in vehicle miles traveled, drop-off in airline miles flown, drop-off in trucking miles, and the resultant effect on our economy. Looking back at it, almost every recession has been preceded by a spike in oil prices.
Well, you set Alan Greenspan up for the question then, don't you?
I
did. Correlation?
There is correlation, but it's difficult to generate cause. Let me just say this. We have been trying for decades to understand all of the various interrelationships between crude prices and the economy as a whole. And the one thing that just strikes you immediately is that we consume, even now, 9 million barrels a day of motor gasoline on our highways, and another 2.5 million of diesel. That is 11 million barrels a day out of a world production of under 90. And that is what is fundamentally driving the price issue and the reason we're getting spikes periodically, because it's an extraordinary problem that we cannot seem to resolve, largely because we have this huge stock of motor vehicles on the highway. They're huge fuel consumers, and there's only one source of feeding them, which is basically partially, in some cases wholly, imported crude, which we refine into motor gasoline. Fortunately, we're beginning to see a very major change coming from shale gas. Shale gas is going to be the most important issue in energy so far in this century. And remember that it's going to move in one form or another into liquid form. And so as far as I can see, the way to avoid the correlation, even if it's not cause and effect, is to make sure that we're not in a position where we're dealing with this extraordinary phenomenon where our motorists are eating up such a large part of world oil. And were we to be deprived of that, which we are periodically, it has dramatic effects. We have the capacity through through gas and, I mean, I'm not a great fan of the use of natural gas for transportation. I think it's got a lot of problems. But taking this extraordinary bonanza of shale gas and moving it into the liquid form and then employing that for effectively a motor fuel, which we can do, strikes me as just the most important economic national security issue that I think is currently on the agenda. Before we dive into the particulars of that, I'm going to stay on the national security angle for just a moment and bring a few more voices in. Norm Augustine, CEO, leader of our military. We don't hear people make the connection 10 years after 9/11. Very much and very directly to our vulnerability to terrorism, what has taken place, and oil. Do you?
I certainly do. In our military, we depend very much on modern equipment. And our tanks don't run, our airplanes don't fly, and our ships, by and large, don't sail without oil. And if we have to import oil from other countries, some of whom may not be our friends in the long term, it puts our military in great jeopardy in terms of its ability to carry out its missions. Furthermore, if you think in the past of the number of conflicts that have begun because of battles of issues over energy, you think in World War II of the terrible losses we sustained trying to take out the German petroleum supplies. As long as we remain vulnerable to that, we're going to have our future in other people's hands and people who don't like us very well. And I can't remember who said it, but somebody not long ago said that something to the effect that we've run out of money, it's time to start thinking. And I think that's where we are here.
You might refer to that in this town as an occupational hazard.
Well, it could be. And, you know, I'm an aerospace engineer, and this isn't rocket science. We know how to produce alternative fuel sources without using food-based inputs. We know it could be economically competitive. What we're dealing with here is a policy issue that we just have to get with it.
Secretary Roche, you were former Secretary of the Air Force in the Bush administration. If this connection, this national security connection, is so compelling, despite the gyrations in price and we get let off the hook when the prices come down, why has it been so difficult to make this case and get anything done in the august halls of the Congress and through the heads of the American public, which, frankly, they fill up. They know when it costs $4 a gallon. I think people get it at some level.
There's a couple of things going on. One, the Air Force is the largest consumer of carbon products in the United States government, followed by my good friend from the Navy.
Competition so all the time, right? You guys are always competing.
No, well, in this case, they are joining us. And in fact, we have qualified a very large number of jets to fly on something other than pure avgas. The problem is it costs more. It costs more to make and what we have to date, but we can do things to the engine so that they'll accept. Jet engines are easier. Good jet engines run on kerosene if you just tune it right. So the point that's always struck me is that the services get it and have been doing things on their own. There are certain obstacles, for instance, to put solar into all the bases in the Southwest where the Air Force primarily is, runs into these interesting rules that Congress has put in about how much money you get back and when you get it back, which makes it tough to compete against other sources like natural gas for the base itself. In the airplane sense, the leadership of the country hasn't joined this. I mean, the president travels around Washington in 2 great big Cadillacs and 14 Suburbans, you know, to go to a place in Laurel to praise a company that makes trucks so they can use biofuels. And I happen to be stuck in traffic, so this is very poignant to me. And I'm not counting the District of Columbia police. It'll change when the leadership starts to do things like, say, we're not going to interfere with the market, but what we are going to do is we control the big market. They control tens of thousands, 100,000 to 250,000 cars, small trucks throughout the United States. make those go on different types and compete the different sources.
That's a great idea, but where's the money and where's the political will to do that?
But if the money part is driven by the fact that it'll be in the interest of this consumer, this huge government, to find the most efficient way to make these, and people will start to invest if they know they've got a consumer of that size. And in fact, you'll find out which ones work better. I happen to think hybrid technology and electric motors is coming a long, long way, although I know all the dangers of lithium batteries. But there are solutions that are coming. What's interesting is some of the hybrid work is not coming along to stop the use of oil. It's because you can actually make a heck of a lot faster Porsche if you have 4 electric motors on the wheels and an energy flywheel. And all of a sudden it's coming into people's mind that this is a technology that could be fun. And therefore, it'll start to create its own market. Or just last month, a Nissan Leaf made the Pikes Peak run, and it beat half of the cars. They didn't expect it.
Let me ask you one more question before coming down the line here. Specific to this dependence on this fuel and our military readiness. There's a straight line there, is there not?
There is. There is a sense that in certain cases, like in the Middle East, Kuwait has given us fuel because of what we did for Kuwait. But generally, you're absolutely correct. But we use fuels, all kinds of fuels, in very inefficient ways, yet we have thinking about how to do it in a much more efficient manner.
Jim, you want to jump in? I just want to get to a couple of other voices we haven't heard, but then
something about why people have not been able to change when they're ready.
Go ahead.
There are 2 myths. One is about 90% false, and the other is about 99% false. One comes from the conservative side, generally the political spectrum, the other from the liberal side. Both are highly debilitating with respect to our doing what we need to do. The one from the conservative side that's only about 90% wrong is that by drilling domestically, we can solve the overall oil problem, or getting it from Canada. Britain was so-called energy independent in 2008. They, from the North Sea oil, they could have had all their own oil. They also saw oil hit $147 a barrel. They also had skyrocketed. Why? How could this be if they could have produced all of their own energy? Because it doesn't matter. There's one worldwide market in oil. It also doesn't matter if you buy from Canada rather than Saudi Arabia. Somebody else just buys more from Saudi Arabia and less from Canada. You help the balance of payments. That's not negligible. That's the 10%. But that's really all you do. And the other one, on the liberal side of the political spectrum, is that renewables, like solar and wind, are going to help us solve the national security problems with oil. 99% of American electricity is made by doing something other than burning oil. I love wind. I love solar. I like working on those issues. It cleans up the environment. That's good. But it has essentially nothing to do with the oil problem at all. 99% wrong. So one thing we kind of need to do is be, I think, rather sharp, including with people we agree with on other things, and we agree with on some aspects of energy, in knocking down these myths as being what can solve the problem.
You're pretty good at being sharp with people, Jim, so I'm looking forward to that.
Shucks.
John Hofmeister, why are you here?
I think energy security is coupled with economic security. We're hollowing out our nation. With the money that we are shipping out of this country, not being reinvested in this country, I happen to be chairman of the National Urban League, in addition to other matters that I connect with. And the constituents of the National Urban League and 102 affiliates all over the country are among the most needy and least attended to and most jobless people that are served. And when you take a family that has transportation requirements and they have very, very limited disposable income, they are making critical choices about food and medicine and fuel. And they see no way out of it. And so we can't continue this way. to hollow out the economic well-being of the nation and the impact that it has on national security. As an oil executive, I don't think we have to have much sympathy for what oil and gas executives do in their boardroom, because they have a global marketplace. They have lots and lots of marketing opportunities for the oil and gas that are produced. And if you look at what has happened in the last 5 years with the portfolio movement of the 5 majors, BP, Shell, Chevron, Conoco, and Exxon, and if you look at what the big independents have been doing, like Devon and Anadarko and Chesapeake, what have they been doing? They've been chasing natural gas. So natural gas, Daniel Yergin just wrote a new book on it, and we are going to have such a resource development opportunity in this country that most of what they're worried about with respect to natural gas is there's not enough market to use up the supply at a price that they can return on investment.
The gas industry itself is saying.
And so natural gas becomes an ally or a linkage between the fuels market and increasing overall demand for natural gas, which will have a favorable price impact. So, and if you're also running a bunch of refineries, if you've noticed in the last 2 or 3 years, the refinery industry is really a drag on earnings for most of the oil companies, and a lot of them are closing them as rapidly as they can, if they can, or selling out, or splitting the portfolio, because the fuels business as it is oversupplied relative to the demand, and these are old facilities that require huge capital investment, and that's not going to get a whole lot of new investment. And so if there was a substitute fuel that either the oil companies could invest in making methanol or other companies could invest in making methanol, that represents an opportunity for fresh capital to go into what can be a more profitable enterprise, because people will flock to it when the price is lower.
So you're putting this in strict business terms and saying the oil companies should not just be oil companies.
Many of them have moved on philosophically from just being the John Rockefeller style oil and gas, and have really looked at, they've embraced renewables. In the portfolio that I had responsibility for, we had wind, solar, biofuels, hydrogen as a mix for the future.
But those are
of
tiny.
fuels.
Those are tiny parts of the portfolio.
Tiny, but let's test it. Let's see what it takes to make it profitable.
But if that's the president, we'll call him back. Bud, you and Jim wrote in the New York Times today, your op-ed piece, How to Weaken the Power of Foreign Oil. So we've set the stage here. We understand some of the political, economic, business, national security considerations. And you talk about this bill that was introduced today. How do you, through this bill, weaken the power of foreign oil, and how fast, if it were to be successful?
Bud, go ahead.
Well, Frank, first of all, the New York Times wrote the headline, Jim and I didn't. And I say that only because we're not focused on doing away with oil.
Well, it says how to weaken the power of foreign oil.
Yes. But for those who say, let's develop our own domestic oil in the United States, absolutely. And if we can import from Canada, good. Our point is that that product ought to be in a market that is competitive with other fuels, and that a consumer in the United States ought to be able to go to the pump and pick whatever is cheapest that day. That's the way it is for a Brazilian who can drive today up to the pump, decide whether, as you did, do you want ethanol today or gasoline? What's best for your pocketbook? And that is feasible because Brazil required that every automobile sold be capable of running on 2 fuels at least.
And they also required that every service station offer the mix of fuels. So there's the market and there's the supply.
Well, we believe that if you can establish that market, That is, if investors from mom and pop to hedge funds can see that there are 15 million, 20 million cars on the road that can burn it, that's a market. They will invest in ramping up the production of methanol, ethanol, biodiesel, and those products will become available. But it does take the visible evidence that there are going to be a lot of cars that can burn this stuff, hence the need for the bills that are going to the Congress. And here, let me try to engage in a friendly fashion my Republican colleagues who can't stand mandates. Well, ladies and gentlemen, today we're living with a mandate. A mandated monopoly of one fuel. Let's mandate competition and introduce the alternatives that Senator Johnson have talked about earlier.
Jim.
Following on this mandate notion, Bud and I were up with several others who are here visiting a couple of senators today, and one thing we handed out was a pair of marvelous quotations that were found by Gal Luft, one from Milton Friedman and the other from Friedrich Hayek. And both say clearly and decisively, essentially, the major job of government with respect to the economy is destroying cartels. The worst thing you can do for the free market is to permit a cartel to exist. We need some approach that recognizes that what Teddy Roosevelt did to John D. Rockefeller needs to happen, but in a different way. And requiring the use of requiring flexible fuel vehicles is so simple that it's negligible in cost. I frankly think the only reason the car companies are fighting it now is because they get a CAFE credit for producing flexible fuel vehicles, and they're worried that if all vehicles have to be flexible fuel vehicles, they may lose their CAFE credit. Somebody just goes to them and says, hey, we'll take care of your CAFE credit, you get to keep it. I think their opposition will begin to wither away, but that is central. We've got to break the cartel.
Senator.
Wouldn't you know, the Chinese are ahead of us again. The Chinese have a program. Right now, they've got 35,000 cars that are being fueled on various grades of methanol, experimenting which is the best, and with plans to go 10 times that already in their 5-year planning cycle. You know, the Chinese just seem to get it these days. Why should the Chinese be ahead of us on methanol when we're the big users of fuel? We can do it, and we can do it soon.
They have a command economy.
Senator Hart.
Back to the military, it would help when you've asked the same question in various ways, why don't we? It would help a lot in terms of public education if we did a very basic economic thing, and that is internalize the cost of gasoline, particularly from abroad, or petroleum, internalize the externalities. For example, the United States Navy. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 40% of the entire military budget of this country is allocated directly or indirectly to the protection of international oil supplies, particularly from the Persian Gulf area. If you internalize those costs, paid by the taxpayers of the United States, we are paying $6 to $7 a gallon for gasoline. And it may be $8.
John Hofmeister, where do you see the price of gasoline headed? And then we'll come to Chairman Greenspan.
Well, I said last December, based upon the economic growth that we were experiencing in the third and fourth quarter of last year, that at the present rate, we would be facing $5 gasoline by late 2012, which meant crude oil prices north of $140, $150 a barrel.
Still see that happen?
Growth has slowed, or all but non-existent, and the demand destruction because of high gas prices has set in, reducing. But here's the point. We could use 1 million or 2 less barrels a day in this country through demand destruction and still see the price go up, because the world, the developing world, is shifting. China's going to go from 9.5 million barrels a day this year to 15 million barrels a day by 2015, 5.5 million new barrels. India's going to go from 4 to 7. And the rest of the developing world will need at least another million. So you're looking at about 10 million barrels a day. And even if the U.S. declines its consumption, we're still going to see price increases.
We're in that marketplace where we buy.
And we have, you know, I think, offended our own ability to produce by the draconian steps taken in the Gulf of Mexico following the BP disaster to stop drilling. We will see decline in oil production in the Gulf of Mexico as high as 1 million barrels a day by virtue of domestic oil, by virtue of what we've done. So we are assuring ourselves of triple-digit and oil probably tending towards the $150 mark.
So you think that the American consumer, the American military, will easily be paying more, and in cases substantially more, in the foreseeable future? That's just inevitable, regardless of what happens in this economy.
Well, there's something else that's happened. This is not well known. China can't produce enough oil to feed itself, and they have locked into guaranteed supply contracts with national state-owned oil companies to the tune of $120 billion in loans in just the last 3 years, where they get first oil. That oil will not come into the global trading market. That goes to China first. Now, you may say, well, that relieves some of the pressure on the global trading market, but it could reduce what's in the global trading market given the declines in many basins around the world.
Chairman Greenspan, you hear this and worry you?
Well, I don't require to hear that to worry me. I'm worried. Let me tell you one which really disturbs me. We're all looking at the Arab Spring in a benevolent way, and we're not sure that's true. And if you think in terms of how insecure our global oil system is, anything which makes it more insecure is very frightening. For example, in 2006, there was an almost successful raid on the 7 million barrel a day oil processing facility in Abqaiq, just in Saudi Arabia. They got very close. Now, I grant you, it is not that simple to take a sprawling operation like that and do great damage to it. But all they need to do is to knock out 3 or 4 million barrels a day, not to mention the fact that we're sitting there with the Straits of Hormuz still as the major bottleneck in the movement of oil out of the Persian Gulf. We are just awaiting for the next crisis to occur, because if this terrorist raid in 2006 had actually worked, we would have had a major catastrophe in the world. The problem, basically, is the fact that they almost did make it work. And they got stopped sort of partway through the security operation. Now, to be sure, the Saudis have very significantly revved up their security, as indeed most people have. But it's in the nature of this very fragile system that it does not take much to break it.
So, Bud, very briefly, give us the top elements of what this bill, what this Open Fuel Standard Act would require or would trigger. And then let's talk about how you might get there, how it might take shape.
Frank, the bill that is in both chambers now calls for automobiles to be sold in America have to be warranted, able to use an alternative fuel. The bill does not pick winners. The alternatives can be all of those we've named: methanol, ethanol, biodiesel. But it simply says that not only Ford, Chrysler, and GM, but BMW, Toyota, or anyone else that wants to sell a car here has to warranty it to burn on something in addition to gasoline. And though we haven't talked about it here tonight, as consumers and as Brazilian consumers, when they go and one day they use one, the next day the other, don't worry about it. The chip in your car, tells you what's in it, and it works fine. But that's all the bill really does. There are broader measures that can do good things. Senator Lugar has a second parallel bill that I won't confuse you with. One of the things it does do is raise revenue by encouraging more drilling, because, of course, more drilling means more revenue.
Secretary Peters, that sensor, that gizmo in the car that would allow it to run on virtually any fuel, costs $100 or a little bit more. What would the effect be if that was under the hood in every new car made in America, do you think? As a practical matter, would it start triggering this competition of fuel? It still costs what it costs to make the fuel. People still are used to pulling up to the gasoline pump.
Yeah, Frank, I think it would trigger that type of demand for alternative fuels and alternative fuel distribution systems throughout the country. Correlation I would give you is in telecommunications and cell phones. We used to carry something that looked like a big brick around, and we had very poor service. We didn't have to pay people to go out and discover that if they put more cell towers up and provided service more broadly, then more of us would buy into that service. And I truly believe that the same thing would happen with this. If we have automobiles that are produced with an open fuel standard, that demand will create the infrastructure that will both give us that fuel and the distribution systems for that fuel.
Senator Cantwell is a co-sponsor of this Senate bill along with Senator Lugar, so it's bipartisan in both bodies.
Norm Augustine, why is this so hard? I mean, I'm sorry. $100 to create this variety, to create an appetite?
You can't even get a good floor mat for $100 in a car.
You can barely get a latte for $100. I mean, of course, I buy latte at very exclusive places, but I mean, I don't get it. I teach these young people, and I was out there at the Solar Decathlon. There's an army of people who say, fix this. Why is this so difficult?
You know, I wish I knew the answer. It's not a technical issue. It's not an economic issue. It's a leadership issue. And we need somebody to step in and bring these bills into being would be a great step. I worry a lot about the competitiveness of our country from a business standpoint. And to me, competitiveness means jobs for Americans. And we have a lot of disadvantages. Our labor costs are very high by world standards. The marketplace is moving to Asia. China, in about a decade, is said to have more middle-class families than we have than our total population at that time. So the market's moving abroad. And if we don't find a way we can compete and take away some of these handicaps, and the one way we can compete is through innovation, and this is an example of innovation. Our companies use petroleum products to run their factories, to deliver their products. Actually, many of the products are made from petroleum. And here we have a chance to take a step that'll make us more competitive. It'll create jobs in America. And we haven't talked much about the environment, but there's a big issue there, too.
Senator, we have these E85 cars now. They've largely been used as marketing devices for the auto companies, but it's very hard to find the fuel. It's more expensive than the other stuff that's out there. It hasn't taken off. That has, in fact, lived under the hoods of some number of cars. So what's to suggest that if this happens, as Secretary says here, there will be some sort of sea change, unless you're going to require service stations to make that fuel available?
Well, I think the market will do that. You know, the interesting...
But wait. You think the market will do that? How?
Well, if you've got a fuel that's $1 a gallon cheaper, people are going to go to that fuel. The fuel works. Look, Formula One racing for 2 decades was methanol. And by the way, back in the 80s, the Department of Energy said, you know, methanol is cheap, let's do a demonstration. They went to California, they got 15,000 cars, it worked great. The people loved it, and then the market in crude oil crashed down to, what, $5 or $6, and they said, what's the point? Crude oil is so cheap, it'll be cheap forever. This has been obvious for a long time, and when you put it out there on the market for people to buy it at a cheaper price, when it really works, the market will, this is one thing that you don't need to subsidize.
John, do the oil companies want cheaper fuels?
You know, the oil companies gave up the retail business a long time ago. They do supply at a wholesale level to the retailers, but the oil companies have concluded they're technology companies. Their best bet is to spend their capital on technologies that go after the raw materials.
Will they embrace or resist methanol?
Well, I've had many conversations with wholesalers and dealers and station owners over this. If they have a product that they can sell, these are retail people. They love to sell, and they just will sell anything that will make them some money at the forecourt. And if it's, you know, we put some E85 stations into Chicago where my former company still had a few retail stations left. People didn't like the E85 in Chicago because all that freeway driving, they got a lot less miles per gallon at a higher price.
Right.
What's the point? Fewer miles per gallon at a higher price. If it's a lower price, Americans love a deal.
You know,
so I think the retailers will jump on something that will give them margin that they don't get from other sources.
Frank, a couple of numbers.
Go ahead.
Methanol today, buy at the hardware store, I think is about $1.10 a gallon.
For which?
$1.10 a gallon for methanol.
Methanol.
It's wood alcohol, just wood alcohol. It's used to clean things, it's all over the place. If you have to about double the amount in order to have the equivalent amount of energy to gasoline. So say you need 2 gallons to make up for 1. You're still just above $2 per gallon of gasoline equivalent, which is $1 or so below where gasoline is now, and certainly below where gasoline is going to be after these developments that have been described for the next year or 2 or 3. So there's a big cost advantage, price advantage.
Secretary.
I very much agree with Jim, but you have to keep in mind diesel fuel used to be much cheaper than gas. And those of us who have boats, marine diesel was even cheaper because they didn't have taxes on it. Diesel now is more expensive, and if you press the system and say, well, why is it? It's because of distribution costs. You can't use new fuels and think of a price without adding to the price Jim's talking about, the distribution costs. And if you mandate a gas station, tell them you have to do this, they'll pass that cost right on. And when you push the gizmo, it's not going to be at $1.16 a gallon. It's going to be a lot higher.
So then how do you get, and how does your plan envision getting that to people?
Where it's so simple it's scary. If you have something that's good or better and it's cheaper, and you just allow the market to obtain. Look, who would have bought a Prius 20 years ago, besides my friend here? But once, well, he's got Prius and Volt, he's overdone it. But the point is, once people realized they could buy something like that, and that they could really save money, and they were daily commuters, it becomes the commuter's choice car.
You know, Frank, 10 days ago today, we commemorated the 10th anniversary of the greatest attack on this country since Pearl Harbor. And I was reflecting on that, that wouldn't it have been nice if in the wake of that attack, with there's such a spirit of patriotism, what can I do as an American to help reduce this threat, to get back? If we had passed something like a patriot tax, marginally coming in at a slow ramp rate on a gallon of gasoline, think how much more secure and prosperous we would be today if we had wisely used those dollars. So I think that Norm Augustine is right. We need leadership, and we need leadership that puts ourselves into 2021 or 2025 and looks back at 2011 and says, what did we do then that makes us more secure and more prosperous and keeps our young men and women in uniform out of harm's way in a greatly globalized, highly competitive, more prone to conflict world because of this strategic commodity called oil?
You say we need leadership. I've heard several of you say we need leadership. From where? Is it
from us. From us.
Like Air Force One and Air Force Two, so 747 and 757, can operate on other type of fuel than just avgas. We can make B-52s do it, C-17s do it. These are big airplanes. It starts with the leadership of the country.
I'm a big believer in of the people, by the people, and for the people. You know, after 9/11, we saw a lot of these magnet stickers, the yellow ribbons, support our troops. That's a great spirit. It's a nice thought. But it's not walking the walk. Walking the walk is realizing that every time we stick that gasoline nozzle in our tank, we are somehow fueling the war against our troops that are being killed by petrodollars.
Senator Hart?
People, I think, are ahead of the leadership here. This city is now so frightened by the T word, tax, that you can't even bring it up. But we could do more to achieve the objectives that we've talked about by putting a carbon tax on, or doing what I proposed 30 years ago in legislation, taxing imported oil, which would have returned $1 or $2 trillion to our treasury by now.
Those taxes are.
And people say, you can't do that, the American people won't stand for it. Well, I just give you two personal examples that are somewhat dated, but they're not to compliment myself, but to point out how much smarter the American people are. Jimmy Carter, in 1980, after 2 oil embargoes, proposed a 10-cent tax on a gallon of gasoline, one time, 10 cents. 11 United States senators voted for it. I was one, and I think I was the only one running for re-election in a conservative Western state, and I was re-elected. 2 years later, having introduced a $10 a barrel tax on imported oil, I undertook a campaign of folly running for president. And I was told, forget about New Hampshire, because every New England state heats its homes with imported oil. I campaigned on that issue and won every New England primary. The American people will listen. And if I over-dramatize this about trading the lives of our sons and daughters for Persian Gulf oil, it is to make that point.
You agree, Senator Johnson?
I absolutely agree. You know, this is not pie in the sky. This is absolutely doable. I mean, we've got a product that can be produced cheaper than foreign oil, and why don't we do it?
But if you're talking about a tax, I mean, I remember President Reagan, there was talk in the Reagan administration about putting taxes, a suggestion of a tax on gasoline. There was a suggestion, remember the famous Al Gore BTU tax? Yeah. We can't do these things. Politics smothers this in the crib.
Well, wait a minute. I love this group, and I want to see it succeed. So, Gary, and I love you, but let's don't talk about taxes. Let's talk about methanol cheaper than gasoline, because taxes will scare too many people. Methanol is cheaper than gasoline. Just remember that. And you don't have to have a tax to make it go.
We just heard, though, that diesel was cheaper than gasoline, too, isn't anymore.
Well, these are distribution issues. The fundamentals
stay there.
Really are that with hydrofracturing and natural gas down at $4 a million BTUs, you can make methanol for around $1 a gallon, maybe less.
That's what I want to talk about for a minute.
There are distribution issues and so forth, said Jim and others, but that is the reason that this has gotten such attraction, using it together with gasoline or ethanol.
John,
give people a choice.
John, Senator, Bud, any of you?
Yes.
Talk a little bit about methanol, where it might come from, the underlying supply, and the connection now with these immense natural gas deposits that we have found in this country. Somewhat controversial for the fracking in some places, but nonetheless, massive deposits.
Well, Frank,
go ahead.
I will defer to John. I think that your recurrent question about what does it take for us to do this, we don't have the leadership, but I do think that ultimately Americans like to make a profit, and alternative fuels are going to be a profitable business. And I don't say that because I'm not an investor, but when I go to hedge funds and I'm trying to rally support for these alternative fuels, they say, every one of them, but we get it. This works. Methanol works, gas to liquids, ethanol, cellulosic, biodiesel, all of them work, all of them are scalable, we get it. And we will invest in it when there are a lot of cars that can burn it. Right now, there is no market. And so that becomes the problem, and that's what unites us here tonight. That if there were 15 million or more automobiles, starting with government, state, federal, local, that's a market. And that will draw the investment in that ramps up the production of these alternative fuels. At the end of the day, it's people, whether Wall Street or Warren Buffett or any other bright investor, will see a profit, and there is one.
Yeah. I think when you look at the natural gas supply and combine it with the advances in technology, both hydraulic fracking technology and horizontal drilling technology, we have moved in 3 to 4 years into a new, totally new world of supply of energy. The hydraulic fracking can be done in ways that are sustainable and responsible and protect the water and require the management of surface water that you've brought up from below. That's a regulatory matter, and it has to be enforced. But best practices and the following of best practices by responsible operators, I think we will see very few instances of the anecdotes that Gasland tried to portray, and there's going to be a Gasland 2 that comes out, I think, on HBO, taking these anecdotes and turning them into an unreality. Secondly, in the hydraulic, or in the horizontal drilling, everybody, I think, is probably familiar with coal veins, and coal veins in coal mines that can go on for miles. That's what shale gas is like. You have these geological substrata that go on for miles. When the horizontal drilling first started, maybe 4 years, I mean, it started a long time ago, but in the last 4 years, we've gone from roughly 100 up to 1,000 feet of horizontal pipe, up now to about 8,000 to 10,000 feet of horizontal pipe. And when
2 miles of pipe.
When you frack that, you are letting loose gas molecules in orders of magnitude greater than we have ever produced vertically. So when you do a vertical well, you just don't get but the depth of that shale formation. When you go horizontal, you get the whole banana. And so as a result of that, you have all this gas looking for a market. And a liquid fuel market, because of internal combustion engines, is a huge market.
Jim, sorry, Senator, you want to jump in here?
Well, I was just going to say, don't forget about coal. We're the Saudi Arabia of coal. You can make methanol from coal. And actually, a plant being built in Louisiana to make methanol from actually using pet coke, which is a refinery necessary product of refining, but basically the same thing as coal. They're going to make the methanol, capture the CO2, and use the CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And you get about 40% of what you originally had in an oil field by enhanced oil recovery using the CO2. Talk about a win-win. I mean, that's not a pipe dream. That's being done in Lake Charles, Louisiana right now. There's another one in Indiana that's basically doing the same thing. This is not a pipe dream. It's workable.
I want to ask Jim Woolsey and then go to the audience for a few questions. And Chairman Greenspan, if you have to leave, you have a...
Yeah, unfortunately.
We'll certainly understand that. If you have any tips for us before you do, we'll take those.
I do, but I've forgotten them.
I see. Jim Woolsey, I know that you have been very outspoken on a number of these things, also cellulosic ethanol. You're very engaged in the whole plug-in process. In terms of the making of methanol, break that down for us for just a minute, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience questions and observations on the practicality, questions, politics, anything that you may have on this topic.
Well, human beings have been making both grain alcohol and wood alcohol for a long, long time. And methanol is just wood alcohol. It's all over our lives. It's the windshield wiper fluid in your car. You can buy it at the hardware store. We had a big ethanol business in the United States until a few years ago when the price of natural gas skyrocketed, and a large number of the methanol plants closed down and started operations in China. But it's not that hard to start back up, and it's not as if there's any technological challenge. It's not as if this country doesn't know how to make methanol with natural gas. We do that just fine. And I think that it would, we have experts in the audience as well as John here on the stage who know a lot more about the chemical process that does it, but it's a pretty simple one. And natural gas is an ideal feedstock for it. You can't drink it. When people say it's poisonous, I mean you can't drink it. The only fuel you can drink is ethanol, because it's 200 proof vodka, basically. I've always said that one good reason to go to ethanol is that tailgate parties are so easy. All you need is a long straw and a lime.
Don't forget the lime.
Other
the
than
lime's
the fact
important.
that you can't drink methanol, it is very safe. It doesn't catch fire easily. It evaporates. If you have a spill, you don't have an ecological problem. It is, except that you can't drink it.
So, Jim, is this the dawn of a new prohibition period?
Well, don't get me started. One of the reasons that Henry Ford lost, and we didn't use ethanol to drive cars on, and General Motors won, and they put lead in the tetraethyl lead to get the octane up, instead of using ethanol, was because this all was taking place in the 1920s. And it was in Prohibition. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen the wonderful old Cheech and Chong movie Up in Smoke about the car made out of marijuana. Well, this would have
What kind of movies do you watch?
In the 1920s.
It was a favorite at the CIA.
Yeah, it was. It's a training film. Come on. we
waterboard him.
But in the 1920s, trying to drive a car on ethanol would have been like trying to drive one on marijuana today. What the hell are you going to do with 200 proof vodka all over the country driving cars in the middle of Prohibition? So we got off onto gasoline and tetraethyl lead. Lead is extremely toxic, of course. We got it out in the 1970s, and what we now use is aromatics. The oil companies give us benzene, toluene, and xylene, which are extremely carcinogenic and with the fine particulates cause very serious cardiopulmonary disease. So you are in that sweet smell you smell when you're pumping your gas, it's cancer, all right? Or maybe heart attacks, one or the other.
I want to go to the audience for questions, but before I do that, very quickly in response to George Shultz a moment ago, senators, he said maybe we should focus on rifle shooting small bills rather than omnibus big bills. Is that the political approach here? Is that what this is all about?
That's what this bill is that we're talking about. That's a rifle shot that says all you got to do is retrofit or fit your new cars to make them tri-flex fuels at an affordable price.
Will it work in this political environment, do you think? Is that the...
We'll find out.
We're up on the Hill. How did it go today?
We'll find out.
Went that well, huh?
we had one very good one. It went
well. It went well. All right.
Okay, if I could, though, before we go, let's go back to leadership, and that this is not an unsolvable problem. This is an eminently solvable problem. It is simple. Let's don't complicate it. What are we going to say to the American people, not if, but when we have the next spike in oil prices? And God forbid it happens when we're trying to work our way out of this recession that we're in right now, and the effect that it has on families. Let's give families the opportunity to have choices so that when that next spike happens, the American people can see leadership and see that we have done something about this problem.
The auto companies embrace this?
They haven't yet. But I believe, and I think the Admiral hit the nail on the head there, the issue is the credits, and the credits that they need for flex fuel cars to meet the CAFE standards. If we can crack that nut, and I believe we can, then why would the automobile companies not want to produce a car that could provide the American people a choice like you have in Brazil, like you have in China, so that families, especially lower income families, are not so terribly disadvantaged as they are today. And as was pointed out so well here, is lower income families are hit disproportionately with high fuel prices, and they are the very ones that have to drive to their jobs.
So I've always wanted to do this. That is to sit in the seat that Alan Greenspan sat in. Now I'm irrationally exuberant, but I won't talk about it. Why don't we go to some audience questions, and we'll start with this gentleman right here.
My name is Jack Greinberg. I'm an independent oil and gas operator. I'm a multi-degreed engineer, and I have to disagree with Chairman Greenspan, that the gas shale is the future of the United States. In the last year, I've drilled 41 discoveries in the Bakken, referred to as shale, but it's a dolomite. And below it is a Three Forks sandstone. That's different than the Marcellus shale. We have the statistical study on the Barnett shale. 12,000 wells at $4, it's an economic fiasco. The shale gas that the industry is now crazy about it is not going to be the answer. $4 gas, you cannot afford to make methanol out of the shale gas that we're supposed to produce. I used to teach reservoir engineering, and you don't have the drainage that you expect to have from the Marcellus shale. It's just not there.
Right, let me call on John and Senator and Norm or anybody else to respond to that.
Represented the Nobel Prize winner in the back.
And the representative, the Nobel Prize winner. But first up, panel.
I think that $4 gas is not sustainable from a return on investment standpoint. But if the market for natural gas grows, supplying that market will likely impact the price of natural gas. The sweet spot for natural gas, however, is not $20 or $25 per million BTU. The sweet spot is more in the $6 to $8 range, where the return on investment is solid, and $6 to $8 natural gas being used to make methanol and coal with natural gas, or petcoke as another. There's just so many ways to make methanol that I think the solution I offer, and the reason I started Citizens for Affordable Energy, is we learned in the 20th century that if you keep the supply ahead of the demand, energy is affordable. So this, to me, is an opportunity to keep the supply of fuel ahead of the demand, and it will be affordable as a consequence.
Could we hear from the Nobel Prize and get your response to that? Can we get a microphone? Yes.
Hello. My name is Surya Prakash. I'm a professor of chemistry at University of Southern California. I collaborate with George Olah, who won a Nobel Prize in chemistry, who is promoting a concept called methanol economy for almost 20 years. Methanol, we believe, is one of the solutions to our problem in the United States, because methanol is a ubiquitous fuel which could be made from many sources. You can make it from coal cheaply. You can make it from shale gas, natural gas. You can make it from biomass by gasification. And ultimately, you can make it from recycled carbon dioxide if you have energy. So it's a good solution for our problems. And methanol, in my opinion, is the fuel which could solve our internal combustion engine issues, diesel substitutes. Even you can make, for example, chemical feedstocks, which we currently make out of oil and gas from methanol.
Frank?
What is your response to the issue of the price point, the market demand component of this? Have you looked at that in terms of the economics? And
I'm a scientist, I'm not an economist, but shale gas for $4, the current price, the methanol could be produced currently in the United States for $1.10.
I've been a big believer that in terms of thinking of our energy challenges, our energy security, our economic security, our national security, there isn't a silver bullet. But there is silver buckshot. And that's what this is all about. Trying to create choice, trying to break a cartel, break a monopoly that makes choice. So while methanol is going to be one of those choices, I don't think we should hold it in such high esteem that we think that is the choice or the energy for transportation. It's one of. We've got wonderful, wonderful sources on our farms, on our ranches, and in our forests called ethanol. There's lots of misinformation about it, but that's another example of we have 10% ethanol supplying our vehicles around there. Can you imagine if we had to buy 10% more petroleum, straight petroleum every year? NASCAR is running 15% ethanol. I'm just using that as an example of the advantages of having choice. Ultimately, we've got to break the monopoly, create flex fuel vehicles, and have choice.
Let me go to this lady right here, and the mic is there. If you'd stand and introduce yourself, and then Hi. Have your question.
How are you? My name is Christy Rudolph, and I'd like to probably just announce myself as probably a standard working mom. I'm a single mom. I have 3 kids that I take care of, and I live in Fairfax, Virginia, which is not an inexpensive place to live. And I drive a Ford Expedition, which is also probably labeled as a non-green vehicle. I get approximately, I don't know, on a good day, 15 miles a gallon, which is horrible. And it's a 2004, and I would love to purchase a vehicle that would be more green and would accommodate my family of 5. But I don't have the resources to do that. Although I can tell you it costs me $100 to fill my tank.
So can you direct your question to the panel?
My question is that, you know, we have all these ideas out here as to what we can do better and how we can do it better. But what do you do for the American family that is not in the non-middle class, that may be considered in the middle class or maybe upper middle class, but can't afford to necessarily purchase another vehicle that would be considered green?
All right, let's let the panel take a shot at that. Sure. Middle class.
Well, Christy, let me maybe come back to you, because I'm also a family, and my daughter drives a big car because she has to, because the kids all play sports as well. Even if you don't buy a flex fuel or an open fuel standard vehicle immediately, if the market drives the cost down, the price of the fuel that you continue to purchase, the gasoline that you continue to purchase will be driven down by the competition of an open fuel standards.
Also, retrofits are not out of the question. You may find very cheap retrofits to turn existing cars into flex fuel.
Okay, we have about 5 minutes, 10 minutes left. Is that all right? I'm just looking around for some. 5 minutes? All right, let's see if we can take some quick questions and quick responses, and we'll move it around. We'll come in the front, and then we'll move it around. I want to make sure we get to the sides, too. Come back.
My name is Max Blankfeld. I'm from Houston, Texas, by the way of Brazil. And when I left Brazil 20 years ago, I was driving an ethanol-based car. At that time, there were no flex fuel cars. It was either ethanol or gasoline. In any case, one of the things that I don't understand is why we insist on corn ethanol when sugarcane ethanol is so much, the yield is so much better. All this talk about interfering with the food chain, in my understanding, is something that's not true. And my second question, which is very important, what Chairman Greenspan mentioned about the Arab Spring and what's going on in the Middle East. Yesterday I had the opportunity to talk to the head of the Herzliya conference, the Herzliya Institute in Israel, and he was telling me that in the last several months there were 3 failed attempts to blow up some oil fields in Saudi Arabia. And they're working now on a simulation of what would happen if the oil goes to $250 a barrel. We are in a race. There is how can we convey this sense of urgency to our government?
We're in a race, so I'm going to race over to Jim Woolsey to quickly answer that question.
Let me take the first one, ethanol. The situation in Brazil is excellent for growing sugarcane, double growing season down in the south, very efficient, burn the bagasse and use it to power the plant, works superbly. Corn is not going to be quite that ideal. And I'm no fan of the tariffs and so forth that have been put on Brazilian ethanol and so forth. But just a word about corn. First of all, about 95% of American corn goes for animal feed, not food. So you're not taking anything away from corn on the cob when you convert a tract of land to growing corn for ethanol. And when you grow it for animal feed, the animals get the protein, which is about half of it. What they don't get is the cornstarch. There are 2 things you can do with cornstarch, and all of these ads saying how terrible it is, you're taking food away, you're taking cornstarch away. There are 2 uses for cornstarch. One is that the Grocery Manufacturers Association folks take them to the big consolidated animal feeding operations, the big factory farms, and jam the cornstarch down the poor cattle's throat and makes them sick. You've got to give them a lot of antibiotics, degrades the antibiotics, and the reason to do that is to make them fat. So you and I get more cholesterol if we really like fat meat. The only other thing you can do with it is turn it into fructose. Fructose, the Grocery Manufacturers Association love because it lets them produce junk food more cheaply and make a bigger profit on it. And they figure, you know, only 1/3 of American children are obese, so there's plenty of room for double-digit growth.
Mark Augustine, very quickly on the national security component of that question.
Well, I don't think there's a great deal to be added. Really, as we've said, the national security is a very important issue. And if we can get ourselves to where we're weaned off of this foreign oil, particularly Middle Eastern foreign oil, we'll probably have less reason to fight wars and we'll have more reason to win them.
Question in the back. I'll come over to you in a minute.
Where's the microphone?
My name is Robert Cohen. I'm a local businessman in Maryland, employ about 200 people. We all started the day the same way. We all cooked our coffee with natural gas. Natural gas is already pumped into my home. So after I finish cooking my breakfast, why don't I just hook up my car to the natural gas, which is already in my home? Now, I know it's a simplistic comment, but I'm a big fanatic on natural gas. The natural gas is already there.
Senator?
So what kind of is the answer to that?
MIT just did a study on natural gas, and among other things, they concluded that the best way to use natural gas as a fuel is not natural gas in trucks or cars, but with methanol, because it costs so much to convert a 16-wheeler to an 18-wheeler to natural gas. It's much cheaper to do it with methanol. And by the way, in answer to a question about the price of methanol from natural gas, at $4 an MCF, you save about $1. But at $8 an MCF, you still save money on an energy equivalent basis over gasoline. So it is cheaper even at $8.
I'll take this one last question if you've got a microphone for this gentleman here, and then we'll be done.
Hello, I'm Mark Rausch with the Auto Channel. I'm a journalist. I'm here to record the events. I drive 2 vehicles. I own a Chrysler CNG van, and I own a Ford Taurus non-flex fuel car. I know all the advantages of CNG, which are great. I disagree with Mr. Greenspan's comments about he thinks that shale will be the best and not CNG. The problem is shale is the future. Shale is sometime, who knows. CNG is now. But more importantly, my vehicle, my Ford Taurus, is a non-flex fuel Taurus. I burn 70 to 80% ethanol in my car. Every time I put E85 in my vehicle, I save anywhere from 70 cents to $1, $1.10. Now, all cars are really flex fuel. And I think that's one of the messages that really I would think, I would love to hear from your organization to take that step, to say that every car since 1990, 1991, something in that area, can use this. So even if this lady wants to save some money, if she was to put maybe not 80%, maybe not 100%, maybe only 30%, 40%, and she puts ethanol, E85 in her car, in her van, she'll save 80 cents, 90 cents, $1 every single time. And that's something that can happen now, right today. So I think that's important. But my question, I'm sorry, my question is, how does a man who runs for president, who gives an incredible speech in August of 2008 about an energy policy, how does it happen, and I'm asking this because you guys are at the top rungs of government, how does a person go from that to a position of nothing? Is it because somebody with money has gotten to him?
And we'll have a bipartisan response to that. Senator Johnston, you want to, and anybody else want to chime in on that?
I think that's being unfair to Perry.
Well, you delivered the bipartisan response, didn't you?
Well, Perry.
Senator Hart?
I lost the thread of the question, so I have nothing.
Well, the question fundamentally was how, and you didn't mention it by name, but you know, you're a journalist. You're talking about Barack Obama. You're all talking about leadership. Nobody's mentioned the president by name. I'll do that. If you're suggesting that the president doesn't have leadership, his question is, how do you go from the speech, where energy has been a cornerstone, to a place where energy is barely mentioned, and you're all saying that there's no leadership there in any case? What happened?
I have no idea. That's why I live in Colorado.
Frank?
I'm not going to let you off the hook quite that easily.
It would be interesting if the president sent this bill or a more comprehensive set of energy initiatives to the Congress to see what would happen. I think we all know what would happen, but he would at least have made an effort.
And what would happen?
A senior elected official told us today not to expect anything to happen this year on anything.
Because of gridlock?
Well, I'm not going to get into it. You draw your own conclusions.
Admiral.
I think that we need to understand that there's been a lot that's been done. I'm a fierce independent, and I just want to characterize myself. But when you think about CAFE fuel standards, under President Bush, we passed the first CAFE fuel standard, corporate average fuel economy standard, raising the standard to 35.5 miles per gallon by 2020. President Obama came in, brought people together from the auto industry, from California, from environmental groups. Instead of waiting until 2020 to do that, we're going to do it by 2016. He issued executive orders to the whole federal government, including the Department of Defense, to drastically reduce our reliance on oil, to drastically increase our use of electric vehicles, plug-in electric hybrids. There's been a lot that's been done, but that is not sufficient. We need to have a national policy, a national energy policy that has to be cooperation between these two key branches of government. We've got to get out of this political gridlock. That's one of those American independence that you always hear people telling you they're trying to help.
I think it really does get at the heart of this debate. And if I were to urge you to take away one thing tonight, it's this, that this is not a partisan issue. This problem will be solved when there is money to be made by putting investments into alternative fuels. And that will happen when there are cars that can burn it. The question becomes, how do you get a lot of cars on the road? Detroit right now has resisted because of what's been explained here. They're concerned they will lose their CAFE credit with the introduction of alternative fuels. That is a solvable problem. As Jim Woolsey has explained, we've got to engage Detroit and say, no, you can have that. Well, I think that would go 90% of the way toward getting investors, well, toward getting a mandate for flex fuel cars passed. These bills, H.R. 1687, and Senator Cantwell's bill, put it in today, will create the flex fuel production out of Detroit. And that will draw in the investment to ramping up the level of production of methanol from shale gas, of cellulosic ethanol, of biodiesel, and so forth. We can solve this. That's how.
John Hofmeister, let me give you the last word as the industry man here. The observation was made that the American public is ahead of the leadership here in Washington in many ways. In many ways, the corporate America is ahead of the leadership, too, because they are looking at the bottom line. They have to be innovators to survive, by definition. Can leadership on this issue, narrowly and broadly, come from the corporate sector? And if so, from whom?
I think that the corporate leadership, the consuming corporations, can provide excellent leadership because they are the ones that are paying the ultra-high prices with a forecast of more to come. The producer leadership, as I said earlier, are primarily focused on the technologies that produce energy. They're not focused on the market that consumes energy. And so whatever they can do to produce energy more effectively, more productively, more profitably, that's what they will do. And if there's a new market for natural gas, they'll chase it because that's what they do. So I don't see them as obstacles. I see them as allies, but I think it's the consuming corporate leadership that should take the leadership yoke and run with it.
I would like to just, in closing, make one crass promotional point, if I may. I mentioned earlier that I started this project called Planet Forward, and I think you mentioned that in the introduction. The premise behind it is that we need to find ways to engage the public in this discussion. We need to bring the expertise and the work that you're doing to the public and ask for the public to participate. If there's anybody in this room who's got an idea, and I think everybody in the room has an idea, I would encourage you, it's planetforward.org. Purpose here is people can upload their ideas, their videos, the public responds, we put the good ones on TV. Every idea that we put out there has come from an entrepreneur, an expert. I think we need to generate an entirely different kind of conversation. I think this panel is a very important start at that because it's economic security, it's national security, it's environmental security, it's all these things. And Jim and I yelled and screamed at one another as we were doing this documentary, and he's driving away in his Prius with a bumper sticker that said, "Bin Laden hates this car." Fortunately, Bin Laden's not around anymore to hate your car, but
I've replaced the S with a D.
Okay. Hated this car. I get it. Took me a minute, Jim. Took me a minute. But we have got to take groups like this and people with your profile and impact like this and make it public. So thank you for your efforts. I hope this conversation was helpful. Thanks to the audience. And Bud, thanks for asking me to do this. I'll turn it back to Anne.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Frank and to the members of the council. It's not just a few hours this evening that they're spending on this issue. You have to be aware that they're spending an enormous amount of time on this issue. Just today, the members met with the majority leader and the minority leader in the Senate, and we're going to keep on meeting congressional leadership, keep on meeting key people, and taking this message to them. And I think we also all need to thank the Founders Circle. An event like this takes a lot of resources to put together. This entire project is very resource intensive, and without the effort and the dedication and the generosity of the Founders Circle, it would not be possible. So thank you very much. We have also one more group to thank, and that's the staff that worked very, very hard on putting this event together. So thank you. And I want to, before we go on to our fine reception, I want to summarize with really one analogy that I think brings the point that we heard today, all the points that we heard today, home in a very sharp manner. We call this whole process turning oil into salt, because salt was once a strategic commodity. It was the only way to preserve food. And so wars were fought over salt, and countries chose, in some cases, where to place colonies due to where there was an abundance of salt. With the advent of canning and later electricity and refrigeration, salt became irrelevant. Nobody cares who controls world salt reserves. Nobody here, I bet you, knows what the world salt price is or wakes up in the morning and checks their computer to see how their salt stocks are doing. Salt was a strategic commodity because it's a monopoly over food preservation, and oil is in the same position today that salt was many years ago. And just as salt was knocked off its strategic pedestal, oil can be knocked off its strategic pedestal too. And it can become just another commodity, something that's useful for a range of purposes. But the only people who really care very much about it are the people who buy it and sell it in the market. Not people dealing with geopolitics. Not people determining foreign policy. Not people worrying about whether our economy is going to collapse due to a price spike. That's what this is about. Thank you all. Thank you all very, very much for all the effort you have been putting and will be putting into this. And let's go to our reception.
Very well.